Hi there, and welcome back to LeanReads, the channel where we share powerful insights and personal growth lessons through great books. After the Great War, the victors promised peace, but what they delivered was division. Borders were redrawn, nations invented, and entire peoples betrayed. A peace to end. All peace uncovers how the Middle East we know today was born, not from freedom, but from ambition. If you enjoy what you hear and want to dive deeper, we've included a link to the book in the description below. Now, let's get started. Today, the Middle East stands at the heart of global turmoil, from the endless civil war in Syria to the deep-rooted conflict between Arabs and Israelis. Peace, even after a century of diplomacy, still feels out of reach. But how did this region become so fractured? David Fromkin's masterpiece, A Peace to End All Peace, 1989, offers a powerful and unsettling answer. The chaos of the modern Middle East was born not in recent decades, but in the secret dealings and imperial ambitions of Europe during the First World War. The book exposes how European powers, chiefly Britain and France, carved up the ruins of the Ottoman Empire to serve their own interests, redrawing borders, creating artificial states, and setting the stage for conflicts that still haunt the world today. David Fromkin, 1932-2017, was a distinguished historian and professor of international relations at Boston University. Before his academic career, he worked as a lawyer, political advisor, and author of several acclaimed works, including Europe's Last Summer and The King and the Cowboy. With A Peace to End All Peace, Fromkin cemented his reputation as one of the sharpest voices in modern history, dissecting the geopolitical decisions that shaped the 20th century, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the rise of European control. Once a mighty superpower, the Ottoman Empire stretched at its peak, 1683, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, encompassing much of the Middle East, modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Its heart was Constantinople, modern Istanbul, a crossroads of civilizations for centuries. But by the early 1900s, the Ottoman world was collapsing. Nationalism, war, and foreign interference weakened the empire beyond repair. As Britain and France watched the decline unfold, they saw an opportunity not for peace, but for power. Fromkin's book peels back the layers of diplomacy, deception, and imperial arrogance that accompanied the empire's disintegration. He shows how Western leaders, blinded by ambition, created a peace to end all peace. What you'll learn from this book: how British officials viewed the Zionist movement and their growing influence in the crumbling Ottoman Empire, why the Battle of Gallipoli changed Britain's entire Middle Eastern strategy during World War I, the hidden imperial agenda that turned promises of Arab independence into a web of manipulation and betrayal. At the dawn of the 20th century, Europe was racing toward modernity. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the West. Machines roared, electricity illuminated cities, and the great powers of Europe were competing for global dominance. But in the East, the Ottoman Empire was fading into twilight. Once a mighty Islamic caliphate stretching from Vienna to the Arabian deserts, it had become known derisively as the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman system was built on religion rather than nationality. It was a multi-ethnic empire united by Islam, where Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, and Jews coexisted, at least in theory, under the authority of the Sultan Caliph in Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. For centuries, this arrangement worked. But by the early 1900s, the empire was visibly decaying. To the eyes of Western Europeans, the Ottoman world resembled a living museum, a society frozen in time, while cities like London and Paris glowed with electric light. Constantinople only installed electric street lamps in 1912. Unlike France or Britain, Ottoman political control extended only weakly beyond its Anatolian heartland. Many provinces governed themselves in practice, despite the symbolic presence of Ottoman troops. This fragmentation made it nearly impossible to defend the empire's far-flung territories. By the early 20th century, the empire's decline had accelerated. In 1912, Italy invaded and seized Libya, the Ottomans' last foothold in Africa. Around the same time, they lost most of their European lands in the Balkan Wars, including Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self, clinging to the remnants of its glory. Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. It was these dying embers that would soon ignite one of history's most dramatic geopolitical transformations. By 1913, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just collapsing, it was imploding from within. A revolutionary faction known as the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, also called the Young Turks, decided that the empire could no longer survive under its outdated monarchy. Their movement began in 1908 when they overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who had suspended the parliament decades earlier. The revolution temporarily restored constitutional rule and revived hope for modernization. But internal rivalries quickly weakened the movement, leaving the empire vulnerable just as foreign wars loomed. The First Balkan War, 1912 to 1913, proved disastrous for the Ottomans. Defeated by an alliance of Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, the empire lost most of its European territories. In the aftermath, the Young Turks seized full control of the Ottoman government. Their vision was ambitious: to modernize and Europeanize the empire by expanding railroads, electrifying cities, and adopting Western institutions, hoping that modernization might save the empire from total collapse. But not everyone saw the Young Turks clearly. A British intelligence officer and translator named Gerald Fitzmaurice, who served as an advisor to the British ambassador in Constantinople, sent deeply misleading reports to London. He claimed that the Young Turks were a Masonic and Jewish-led organization, calling them the Jewish Committee of Union and Progress. This falsehood would have major geopolitical consequences. In reality, the Young Turks were Turkish nationalists, often hostile to non-Turkish minorities within the empire. But Fitzmaurice's reports shaped British perceptions on the eve of World War I, convincing policymakers that Jewish influence dominated Ottoman politics. As a result, the British government crafted a misguided strategy. To win the support of the supposedly Jewish-led Ottoman leadership, London began considering open endorsement of the Zionist movement, supporting the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This political miscalculation laid the foundation for the Balfour Declaration, 1917, and the tangled British role in the modern Middle East conflict. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads, weakened by decades of territorial losses and fearful of invasion by Italy, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. The empire desperately needed a powerful ally. Germany, young, ambitious, and eager to expand its influence in the East, appeared to be the perfect choice. Berlin promised to protect Ottoman territory and modernize its military in exchange for strategic cooperation. However, the alliance could not remain secret for long. When the British Royal Navy intercepted two German warships fleeing from pursuit, the Ottomans allowed them to pass through their neutral waters, an act that immediately raised British suspicions. Soon after, Ottoman forces laid mines across the Dardanelles, the narrow strait leading to Constantinople. This move convinced the British that Ottoman neutrality was a lie. The final straw came when Ottoman troops, acting under German influence, launched attacks on Russia, a close ally of Britain and France. On October 31st, 1914, Britain officially declared war on the Ottoman Empire. From that moment, the Ottoman lands became the next great prize in the imperial game. The Allied powers, chiefly Britain and France, began drafting plans for a post-war Middle East that would no longer include Ottoman sovereignty. For Britain, this marked a radical shift. For decades, London had protected the Ottoman state as a buffer zone against Russian and Austro-Hungarian expansion, mainly to safeguard trade routes to India. But with that policy now obsolete, and with few unclaimed colonies left in Africa, Britain turned its gaze toward the Middle East, seeing it as the next frontier for empire. Confident of victory, the Allies quietly began to redraw the map of the Arab world even before the war had truly begun. In August 1914, Britain appointed Herbert Kitchener as Secretary of State for War, a move that would profoundly shape its Middle Eastern strategy. Kitchener was no stranger to the region. He had previously served as British Administrator of Egypt, a country technically under Ottoman rule, but effectively controlled by Britain since 1882. His field experience made him the government's leading expert on Middle Eastern affairs, a status that, ironically, allowed his misconceptions to shape imperial policy. Like many British officials in Constantinople, Kitchener's understanding of the region was superficial and romanticized. His plans rested more on speculation than knowledge. London itself knew even less, so no one could challenge or fact-check his assumptions. Kitchener's grand idea was to unite all Arabic-speaking peoples under a single Islamic leader, a caliph, who would rule a vast, loyal federation of Arab states under British guidance. It was a deeply naive vision, based on the belief that the Arabs were a homogeneous, primitive people who would obediently follow religious authority. In reality, the Middle East was, and remains, a mosaic of ethnicities, tribes, and sects. Most were Muslim, yes, but they were divided between Sunni and Shia, among countless linguistic, cultural, and regional identities. Kitchener, astonishingly, did not even recognize the Sunni-Shia divide. This ignorance would have catastrophic consequences. When the war ended, Britain installed a Sunni monarch in Iraq, a nation where the majority of citizens were Shia, sowing sectarian divisions that still exist today. Why did Kitchener cling to such misguided ideas? The answer lies in personal ambition. Behind his talk of Arab independence, Kitchener dreamed of ruling the Middle East himself, not as a liberator, but as Britain's new viceroy of Arabia. Under his vision, local Arab leaders would appear to govern, but British officers would pull the strings behind the scenes. It was empire building in the purest form, masked as moral duty. After the disastrous defeat at Gallipoli, Britain's Middle Eastern strategy was in chaos. The invasion, planned using Kitchener's faulty maps and misguided advice, had failed to seize the Dardanelles, leaving thousands dead and morale in ruins. When David Lloyd George became Prime Minister, he realized that a direct military assault on the Ottoman heartland was too costly. Instead, he chose a more subtle weapon: divide the empire from within by exploiting the resentment of the Arabs, who had lived under Turkish rule for centuries. Enter Mark Sykes, a young Middle East specialist handpicked by Kitchener. Sykes proposed recruiting Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, as a symbolic king who would unite the Arabic speaking peoples under British guidance. But negotiations with Hussein quickly faltered. The Sharif demanded an independent Arab kingdom, free from European interference, an idea that clashed directly with Britain's colonial ambitions. At this moment, a mysterious Ottoman Arab officer named Muhammad al-Faruqi appeared, claiming to have contact with Arab military leaders in Damascus. He told both sides exactly what they wanted to hear: that hundreds of thousands of Arab soldiers were ready to revolt against the Turks. It was a brilliant deception. The British, desperate for a new plan, believed every word, convinced that an Arab uprising could shatter Ottoman control. They agreed to Hussein's conditions and began drafting plans for an independent Arab state, one that would, of course, remain under Britain's quiet supervision. Yet the entire arrangement rested on a mutual lies. Al-Faruqi had invented his army. The British had no intention of abandoning their imperial claims. From its very beginning, the Anglo-Arab alliance was built on illusion and destined for tension. Out of this uneasy alliance emerged one of the most romanticized figures in modern history, T.E. Lawrence, the British officer later known as Lawrence of Arabia. Tasked with liaising between London and Hussein's forces, Lawrence became both a witness and an architect of the Arab Revolt, a rebellion born of hope and manipulation. Hussein's call for resistance initially fell on deaf ears. Despite al-Faruqi's promises, no mass uprising occurred among Ottoman Arab troops. The few who joined were poorly equipped and untrained. Still, the British pressed on. In June 1916, Hussein's fighters captured Mecca, the holy city and symbol of his authority. But their attempt to seize Medina ended in failure. The Ottoman garrison held firm. Lawrence wrote in his memoirs that the Arab fighters lacked discipline and military organization, struggling against an enemy trained in the European art of war. British commanders grew skeptical. To them, the revolt seemed like another doomed adventure. But in July 1917, everything changed. Lawrence and Hussein's troops captured Aqaba, the only deep-water port on Arabia's southern coast, a turning point that opened the route to Palestine. From there, Arab forces coordinated with the British Army advancing from Cairo. Together, they launched a campaign northward, capturing Jerusalem in December 1917 and pushing through Jordan toward Damascus. By now, British forces also controlled Baghdad, and the Ottoman Empire was crumbling under the combined weight of rebellion and invasion. To the world, The conquest of Jerusalem was hailed as a triumph of Christian Europe over the East. To the Arabs, it was proof that liberation was near. But as later chapters reveal, the promises made to them would not be kept. No sooner had Britain promised independence to the Arabs than its diplomats began secretly dividing their lands. In 1915, Mark Sykes, architect of Britain's Arab alliance, entered negotiations with François-Georges Picot, a French diplomat descended from a long line of colonial administrators. Picot came to the table with an agenda shaped by imperial nostalgia. He believed France had a historic right to dominate the Levant, particularly Syria and Palestine, as a legacy of the medieval Crusades. France's goal went far beyond Britain's model of indirect influence. The French sought direct colonial rule, the kind that would turn conquered lands into integral parts of the French Empire. After months of secret talks, Sykes and Picot reached an agreement, one that would alter the map of the Middle East forever. This Sykes-Picot agreement carved the region into zones of control and influence to be enacted once the Ottoman Empire collapsed. France would govern modern-day Lebanon and dominate Syria. Britain would control Iraq, Jordan, and parts of Palestine, including two key Mediterranean ports. The Arabian Peninsula was, on paper, left independent, but in practice would remain under British and French economic control. The arrangement was colonialism by another name, empire, redrawn in the language of diplomacy. The thorniest issue was Palestine, Britain's growing sympathy toward Zionism, the Jewish nationalist movement seeking a homeland in the Holy Land, clashed directly with French ambitions. London was unwilling to share control of the region that it now viewed as both strategically vital and divinely significant. Unable to reconcile their claims, the two powers decided that Palestine would be placed under an international administration after the war, a vague compromise that satisfied no one and guaranteed future chaos. In hindsight, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a blueprint for a century of turmoil, drawn by two Europeans who had never set foot in much of the region they divided. It imposed artificial borders, ignored ethnic and religious realities, and betrayed the very people Britain had promised to liberate. By late 1917, British troops had captured most of Palestine. France, once confident of sharing the spoils, now realized Britain intended to keep the territory for itself. What came next would ignite one of history's longest-running disputes, the Israel-Palestine conflict. The shift began at the very top. Prime Minister David Lloyd George, driven by his Protestant faith and a sense of divine mission, believed Britain was destined to restore the Holy Land to God's chosen people. Before the war, British officials had dismissed Zionism, the Jewish movement to establish a homeland in Palestine, as impractical. They argued that the land was barren and that the native Arab population would never accept mass Jewish immigration. But as the war dragged on, political and religious motives aligned. Sykes and his mentor, Gerald Fitzmaurice, still believed the conspiracy that the Young Turks, the ruling faction of the Ottoman Empire, were secretly controlled by Jewish Freemasons. They reasoned that by supporting Zionism, Britain could win over global Jewish influence, and in particular, keep Russia in the war through Jewish networks there. It was an extraordinary blend of superstition, strategy, and myth, yet it shaped British policy. On November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, issued a short letter that would change the world. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This became known as the Balfour Declaration. To its supporters, it was a promise of hope after centuries of persecution. To the Arab population already living in Palestine, it was a betrayal, an imperial decision made without their consent over their land by a foreign power. The British government presented it as a moral victory, but in reality, it was a political calculation, an attempt to secure global Jewish support while maintaining colonial control over the region. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The declaration legitimized Jewish migration to Palestine, setting off tensions between Jewish settlers and Arab residents, tensions that, a century later, continue to define Middle Eastern politics. By the final year of the Great War, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. British forces and their Arab allies swept northward through Arabia and Palestine, capturing one Ottoman stronghold after another. Victory seemed near, but so did betrayal. Mark Sykes, still clinging to his illusions of an honorable empire, believed Britain could keep all its promises. To the Arabs, to the French, and to the Zionists, reality soon proved otherwise. The first casualty was Hussein of Mecca, Britain's most trusted Arab ally. London decided that Hussein's son, Faisal, was easier to manage, more pliable, more civilized in British eyes. Meanwhile, officials quietly backed another rising leader on the Arabian Peninsula, Ibn Saud, a fierce tribal commander who would one day found Saudi Arabia. This duplicity reached its peak in October 1918, when Allied troops marched triumphantly into Damascus. There, British officers informed Faisal that Syria would soon become a French mandate, as secretly agreed in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. He was also told he would have no authority in Lebanon or Palestine. Faisal protested, but he had little leverage. Exhausted by years of war and dependent on British support, he reluctantly agreed. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed an armistice with Britain, ending the war in the Middle East. The treaty granted the Allies the right to occupy any territory of the former empire. But the Ottoman government misled its citizens, claiming it had negotiated from a position of strength, a lie that helped ignite the Turkish War of Independence 2 years later. Within weeks, British forces occupied Constantinople, while Germany surrendered in Europe. World War I had ended, yet for the Middle East, the age of violence and imperial manipulation was only beginning. As British and French forces spread across the former Ottoman lands, local resistance flared everywhere. The Arabs who had fought for independence soon realized they had merely traded one empire for another. On the Arabian Peninsula, a new rivalry erupted between Hussein of Mecca and Ibn Saud, both of whom Britain had supported during the war. In 1919, Ibn Saud began expanding his territory, invading lands under Hussein's control. A surprise assault in May 1919 crushed Hussein's British-backed army. By 1925, Ibn Saud had expelled Hussein entirely, consolidating his rule over nearly the entire peninsula. In 1932, he proclaimed the founding of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, forever reshaping the politics of the Islamic world. Meanwhile, in Turkey, a different kind of revolution was brewing. British intelligence failed to detect a nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a brilliant Ottoman general. In 1920, Ataturk's 30,000-strong army defeated a French detachment in southern Turkey, sparking a wider rebellion. Enraged and unprepared, the British imposed martial law in Constantinople, occupying the city outright. But the move only fueled Turkish nationalism. When news spread that the Allies planned to formally partition the Ottoman homeland, Ataturk's forces launched a full-scale war of independence. After years of brutal fighting, the revolution triumphed. In November 1922, Ataturk's troops marched into Constantinople, deposed Sultan Mehmed VI, and abolished the Ottoman Caliphate, ending 6 centuries of imperial rule and founding the modern Republic of Turkey. Elsewhere, colonial tensions deepened under a revised Sykes-Picot arrangement. The Middle East was carved into mandates. Britain controlled Palestine, Iraq, and Egypt. France took Syria and Lebanon, although London and Paris promised to prepare these territories for independence. Their real goal was exploitation. They built railways, ports, and oil concessions, not for the people, but for their own empires. The region, once ruled by the Ottomans, had become a chessboard of Western interests. After British troops withdrew from Syria, King Faisal tried to negotiate a compromise with the French. His hope was to preserve a form of nominal independence. Syria would govern itself, while France would act merely as an advisor. But the mood in Paris soon changed. When Alexandre Millerand became French Prime Minister in 1920, he rejected his predecessor's lenient policy. France would not settle for influence. It wanted control. In Damascus, Arab nationalists also rejected Faisal's compromise. They wanted full independence, not another European overseer. Inspired by Ataturk's revolution in Turkey, Syrian leaders declared their own Arab kingdom of Syria in March 1920, claiming the lands of Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon. This act of defiance provoked war. By July 1920, French troops invaded Damascus, crushed the fledgling Arab government, and sent Faisal into exile. The French mandate over Syria and Lebanon was now official, enforced by soldiers and bureaucracy rather than consent. Meanwhile, Britain faced its own nightmare in Palestine. Though internal rivalries prevented a unified uprising, most Palestinian leaders strongly opposed Zionism and the growing British-backed Jewish immigration. Tensions escalated quickly. Armed Zionist militias clashed with local Arabs, sparking violent riots in early 1920. The British soon realized that opposition from the Palestinians would seriously endanger their Jewish national home project. To calm the unrest, London promised prosperity, electrification, irrigation of the Jordan Valley, and new jobs. Officials framed Zionism not as a replacement, but as coexistence within Palestine. Yet Palestinian leaders were unconvinced. They saw the Zionist project not as partnership, but as displacement, a slow erasure of their homeland. Despite resistance, Britain pressed on. In July 1922, the League of Nations formally approved the British mandate over Palestine, embedding Zionism as part of the new state's official policy. The seeds of a century-long conflict had been planted. By the end of 1922, the borders of the modern Middle East had largely taken shape. drawn not by its people, but by European pens. Like the Americas and Africa before it, the region had been divided according to imperial logic, not cultural reality. The great question remained, could these artificial nations survive? For Europe, enthusiasm for empire had waned. The First World War had bled the continent dry. Britain and France no longer had the money, manpower, or moral authority to sustain vast colonies, but the damage had been done. In the post-war order, Faisal, once hailed as the future king of a united Arab world, now ruled a British-made Iraq, not Syria. Hussein lived in exile. Replaced by Ibn Saud's rising kingdom, Palestine was divided by competing promises to Arabs, to Jews, and to Europe itself. Even Britain's support for Zionism began to falter as Lloyd George left office and the realities of unrest became undeniable. The result was chaos, an unstable mosaic of kingdoms, mandates, and rival tribes. The Ottoman Empire, long derided as the sick man of Europe, was gone, but the vacuum it left was filled with colonial rule and political fragmentation. Across these new borders, movements of resistance, religion, and nationalism began to collide, giving rise to endless wars, coups, and revolutions that would scar the 20th and 21st centuries, just as the fall of Rome had plunged Europe into centuries of feudal conflict. The fall of the Ottoman Empire condemned the Middle East to a similar fate, 1,000 years of borders and blood. The violence that grips the Middle East today did not arise by accident. It was born from Europe's betrayal during and after World War I, the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the carving of artificial borders, and the installation of leaders chosen not by their people, but by foreign powers. Britain and France sought stability, but created chaos. Their peace was not peace at all. It was a blueprint for permanent division. Just as the collapse of Rome reshaped Europe's destiny, the fall of the Ottomans reshaped the Middle East, a region still haunted by the ambitions of empires long gone. Reading A Peace to End, All Peace by David Fromkin feels like watching the blueprint of the modern Middle East being drawn, line by line, border by border, mistake by mistake. It's not just a history book, it's a revelation about how human ambition, ignorance, and arrogance can reshape entire civilizations for centuries. What struck me most was how peace itself became a weapon. The title is no exaggeration. The little peace that ended World War I did not heal the world. It rearranged it to suit European empires. Politicians in London and Paris played a high-stakes game with maps and promises, dividing the Ottoman lands like property, with little concern for the people who actually lived there. The result was not order, but an engineered chaos that still defines the region today. Through Fromkin's meticulous storytelling, we see how every modern conflict, from Israel and Palestine to Iraq and Syria, can trace its roots back to those fateful years between 1914 and 1922. The author forces us to confront a painful truth. When peace is built on lies and greed, it becomes the seed of future wars. What I admire most about this book is how it connects the dots between diplomacy, faith, empire, and human error. It reminds us that history is not distant. It's living, breathing, and still shaping the news we read each day. It also offers a timeless warning. Nations that manipulate others in the name of stability are often building the foundations of their own downfall. By the final page, I felt both enlightened and unsettled. The story of the Middle East's partition is not just about maps and treaties. It is about the cost of arrogance, the fragility of trust, and the long shadow of empire. Fromkin doesn't offer easy answers, but he gives us the most important gift a historian can: understanding.